Jake Miller pressed his face against the transport ship's viewing window as Nexus Station came into sight. The massive structure hung in space like a glittering metal city, stretching for miles in every direction. Thousands of ships from across the galaxy docked at its countless bays. Some vessels were sleek and silver, others looked like floating crystals, and a few resembled living creatures more than machines. "First time seeing it, kid?" Captain Lisa Rodriguez asked from behind him. Her weathered face showed the strain of 3 weeks in hyperspace travel. "Yes, ma'am," Jake replied, unable to hide his excitement. At 19, he was the youngest member of Earth's first official diplomatic mission to the Galactic Council. "It's incredible. Look at all those different ship designs." Dr. Michael Thompson joined them at the window, adjusting his thick glasses. "Each one represents a different species. We're about to meet beings that evolved on worlds we can barely imagine." Admiral Robert Hayes grunted from his seat. The gray-haired military officer had been against bringing Jake on this mission from the start. "Just remember why we're here. Earth needs a seat on that council. Our future depends on it." The transport ship docked with a gentle bump. Jake felt his stomach flutter with nervous energy as the airlock cycled open. He had trained for this moment for 2 years, studying alien cultures and galactic politics, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw next. The docking bay was enormous, filled with beings that seemed to come from a dozen different nightmares and dreams. A group of creatures that looked like walking trees conversed with floating jellyfish made of pure light. Nearby, armored giants that stood 12 feet tall loaded cargo with their bare hands. "Stay close," Captain Rodriguez warned. "And remember, we represent all of humanity here." They walked through corridors that stretched higher than any building Jake had ever seen. Alien beings of every shape and size filled the walkways. Some had too many eyes, others had no eyes at all. A few floated through the air without any visible means of support. Jake noticed how the other beings looked at them. Most showed curiosity, but many displayed what could only be called amusement. A group of insect-like creatures clicked their mandibles in what sounded like laughter as the human delegation passed. "They think we're funny," Jake whispered to Dr. Thompson. "Can you blame them?" the doctor replied quietly. "Look around. We're probably the most ordinary-looking species they've ever seen." The delegation reached the council chamber, a massive, dome-shaped room with seats arranged in concentric circles. Hundreds of alien representatives filled the space, their voices creating a sound like nothing Jake had ever heard before. Some spoke in musical tones, others in harsh growls, and a few communicated through flashing lights. High Counselor Veltarn rose from the central platform. The reptilian being stood 7 feet tall, covered in scales that looked like green armor plates, his yellow eyes fixed on the human delegation with obvious disdain. "So," Veltarn said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's translation, "systems. These are the Earthlings we have heard so much about." A wave of what Jake could only describe as snickering swept through the assembly. Ambassador Thylix, an insectoid creature with 4 arms and compound eyes, leaned forward in her seat. "They appear so fragile," Thylix observed. "No natural armor, no enhanced strength, no special abilities we can detect. What exactly do they offer the galactic community?" Admiral Hayes stepped forward, his jaw set in determination. "We offer innovation, creativity, and the willingness to work with others for mutual benefit." Innovation? Veltarn's laugh was like grinding stone. "Your species has barely mastered interstellar travel. Your weapons are primitive chemical propellants. Your ships require artificial gravity because your bodies cannot adapt to space." More laughter echoed through the chamber. Jake felt heat rising in his cheeks, but forced himself to remain calm. "Furthermore," Veltarn continued, "your lifespans are embarrassingly short. What wisdom can beings who live less than a century possibly offer to species that have existed for millennia?" A massive creature near the back of the chamber stood up. Warlord Grex looked like a cross between a bear and a tank, covered in biometal implants that gleamed under the chamber's lights. When he spoke, his voice rumbled like distant thunder. "The reptile speaks truth," Grex declared. "Why should we grant council membership to such weak creatures? On my homeworld, beings like these would not survive their first winter." "Now see here," Captain Rodriguez began. But Grex raised one enormous hand to silence her. "I propose a test," the warlord announced. "If these Earthlings wish respect, let them prove they deserve it. Let one of them face the crucible of shadows." The chamber fell silent. Even the constant background chatter of alien languages stopped. Jake saw fear flicker across several faces, regardless of species. Dr. Thompson leaned close to Captain Rodriguez. "What's the crucible of shadows?" he whispered. Before she could answer, Veltarn smiled, showing rows of sharp teeth. "An excellent suggestion, Warlord Grex. The crucible has claimed champions from dozens of species. If a human can survive what our greatest warriors could not, perhaps they deserve consideration. And if they fail?" Admiral Hayes asked, though Jake suspected he already knew the answer. "Then they die," Grex said simply. "And we waste no more time on species too weak to matter." The chamber erupted in excited chatter. Jake felt the weight of hundreds of alien eyes upon him and his fellow humans. This was it, he realized. This was the moment that would define humanity's place in the galaxy. Without thinking, Jake stepped forward. "I'll do it," he said. The chamber fell silent again. Captain Rodriguez grabbed his arm. "Jake, no, you don't understand what you're volunteering for." "I understand enough," Jake replied, though his heart was pounding. "They think we're weak. They think we don't belong here. Someone has to prove them wrong." Admiral Hayes moved to stop him, but Jake was already walking toward the center of the chamber. "I accept the challenge," Jake announced, his voice carrying clearly through the translation systems. "I'll face your crucible." The laughter that followed was louder than before. Even some of the more serious species seemed amused. Veltarn's smile grew wider. "Brave words from such a small creature," the High Counselor said. "Very well. In 3 standard days, you will be transported to the Crucible. Prepare yourself, young Earthling. You go to face trials that have broken beings. Far stronger than you," Jake nodded, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. As the chamber dissolved into excited discussion about the upcoming spectacle, he caught sight of something that made him pause. In the upper levels of the chamber, a lone figure sat apart from the others. Massive and still, it watched the proceedings, with predatory focus. Even from a distance, Jake could feel the weight of those ancient eyes upon him. He didn't know it yet, but he had just gained the attention of Korath, the galaxy's most feared hunter. Jake sat in the human delegation's quarters, staring at a holographic display that showed a dark, lifeless planet floating in the void. Dr. Thompson stood beside him, his face pale as he read from a data tablet. "The Crucible of Shadows is located on Kepler 442c, the doctor explained, his voice shaking slightly. "It's a rogue planet that was ejected from its star system millions of years ago. No sunlight, no atmosphere, surface temperature of -200 degrees. That doesn't sound so bad," Jake said, trying to sound confident. "We have environmental suits." Captain Rodriguez entered the room carrying a stack of files. Her expression was grim. "Jake, you need to understand what you've gotten yourself into. I've been reading everything our intelligence services could gather about this place." She activated another holographic display. The image showed a massive underground complex carved into solid rock. Tunnels and chambers stretched for miles in every direction, creating a 3-dimensional maze that hurt Jake's eyes to look at. "The Crucible was built by a species called the Architects," Rodriguez continued. "They vanished over 50,000 years ago, but their creation remains. It's a testing facility designed to push living beings to their absolute limits." Admiral Hayes walked in, his face dark with anger. "I've been talking to our alien contacts. Jake, this is suicide. No human has ever attempted the Crucible before." "How many beings have tried it?" Jake asked. Dr. Thompson consulted his tablet. "According to galactic records, over 300 challengers from 47 different species have entered the Crucible in the past 1,000 years." "How many survived?" The room fell silent. Finally, Captain Rodriguez answered. 12. Jake felt his stomach drop. 12 out of 300? "The survival rate is less than 4%, Admiral Hayes said. And those 12 survivors weren't ordinary beings. They were the elite champions of their species. Dr. Thompson pulled up another display showing detailed records. "Look at this, Jake. One survivor was a crystalline warrior from Vega Prime. Their species can manipulate gravity and has natural armor stronger than our best battle tanks. Another was a shadow walker from the Void Nebula. They can become invisible and phase through solid matter." "What about the ones who died?" Jake asked quietly. Captain Rodriguez activated a new file. The most recent casualty was General Thrak of the Iron Legion. His species is naturally 10 times stronger than humans. He could bench press a hover tank without breaking a sweat. He lasted 18 hours in the Crucible. Jake studied the records, trying not to think about what 18 hours of terror must have felt like. "What killed him?" "The reports say he was found on level 3, torn apart by something called shadow wolves. The rescue team said it looked like he put up quite a fight, but whatever got him was faster and smarter." Admiral Hayes slammed his fist on the table. "This is madness, Jake. I'm pulling rank. You're not going." "You can't stop me, sir," Jake replied. "I already accepted the challenge in front of the entire Galactic Council. If I back out now, humanity will be seen as cowards forever." Dr. Thompson pulled up another record. "There was also Princess Zephyr of the Wind Dancers. Her people can fly and control air currents. She could create tornadoes with a thought. She made it to level 4 before something called the Steel Hunters brought her down." "How many levels are there?" Jake asked. 6, Captain Rodriguez answered. "No one knows what's on level 6 because only the 12 survivors have ever seen it. And they're not talking." Jake scrolled through more records. Each death seemed more horrible than the last. Beings with incredible powers, centuries of combat experience, and natural abilities humans could barely imagine had all fallen to the Crucible's challenges. "Tell me about the survivors," Jake said. "Maybe I can learn something from them." Dr. Thompson brought up a new file. "The most famous is Korath of the Valdren. His species are apex predators, 8 feet tall, natural armor plating, enhanced reflexes, and the ability to track prey across star systems. He's completed the Crucible 4 times. 4 times? Jake stared at the image of the massive alien hunter. "Why would anyone go back?" "According to the records, he goes back to hunt the creatures inside for sport," Captain Rodriguez explained. "The Crucible contains the most dangerous predators from across the galaxy. Korath considers it the ultimate hunting ground." Jake studied Korath's image. The alien looked like death itself, with glowing red eyes and claws that could tear through steel. "What makes him so special?" "Intelligence combined with perfect predatory instincts," Admiral Hayes read from the file. "He doesn't just overpower his enemies, he outthinks them. The report says he can predict his opponent's moves 3 steps ahead." "There's something else," Dr. Thompson added, pulling up another record. "I've been analyzing the survival patterns. The beings who lived through the Crucible weren't necessarily the strongest or fastest." Jake leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "Look at this." The doctor highlighted several names. Sage Whisper of the Mind Weavers was physically weak by galactic standards, but she had incredible pattern recognition abilities. Survivor Beta 7 was an artificial intelligence with no physical body at all. It controlled robotic shells. And, Jake pressed, they succeeded through adaptability and unconventional thinking. The strongest challengers often died first because they tried to face every challenge with brute force. Captain Rodriguez studied the data with new interest. You might be onto something, Michael. The failed challengers seem to have relied, too, heavily on their species' signature abilities. Jake felt a spark of hope. So maybe being human isn't such a disadvantage. We don't have any signature abilities to rely on. We have to adapt. Don't get overconfident, Admiral Hayes warned. You're still talking about facing creatures that have killed beings far more powerful than any human. Jake continued reading, through the records. The more he learned about the Crucible's reputation, the more terrified he became. But he also began to notice patterns that others might have missed. The survivors all have one thing in common, he said after an hour of study. They didn't just try to survive the Crucible. They tried to understand it. What do you mean, Captain? Rodriguez asked. Jake pulled up the record of the most recent survivor, a being called Echo 9. Look at this report. Echo 9 spent the first day on level 1 just observing. It didn't try to rush through the challenges. It studied them. Dr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. That's very human behavior. We tend to analyze problems before acting. The question is whether you'll live long enough to use that advantage, Admiral Hayes said grimly. Jake stood up, decision made. There's only one way to find out. I need to prepare for this properly. I want every scrap of information about the Crucible you can find. Battle plans, creature descriptions, environmental hazards, everything. Jake, Captain Rodriguez said softly, are you sure about this? No one would blame you for backing out. Jake looked at the holographic image of the dark planet where the Crucible waited. Somewhere in those tunnels, 12 beings had found a way to survive against impossible odds. If they could do it, maybe a human could too. I'm sure, he said. Humanity deserves a place in the galactic community. If proving that costs me my life, then that's a price I'm willing to pay. As his friends began gathering intelligence for his impossible mission, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. High above Nexus Station, in a ship that registered on no sensors, Korath the Hunter studied the young human who dared to challenge the galaxy's deadliest trial. For the first time in decades, Korath felt something he had almost forgotten: curiosity. The transport pod shook violently as it entered the atmosphere of the rogue planet. Jake gripped his safety harness and watched through the small window as they descended toward a world that had known only darkness for millions of years. The surface below looked like a nightmare landscape of frozen rock and ice. Final approach to Crucible entrance, the automated pilot announced. Challenger will be deposited at Entry Point Alpha. Supply cache includes basic survival gear, rations. For 7 days, an emergency beacon. Jake checked his equipment one more time. Environmental suit, helmet with built-in lights, energy weapon with limited charge, basic tools, and a small medical kit. It seemed pathetically inadequate for what lay ahead. The pod landed with a heavy thud. Through the walls, Jake could hear the howling of winds that would freeze a human solid in seconds. His environmental suit would protect him, but only for a limited time. Crucible entrance detected, the pilot announced. Opening pod doors in 10 seconds. Good luck, Challenger Miller. The doors slid open, revealing a metal hatch built into the frozen ground. Ancient symbols covered its surface, glowing with a faint blue light. Jake stepped out onto the planet's surface and immediately felt the crushing weight of isolation. Above him, alien stars provided no warmth, no comfort. He placed his hand on the hatch's scanner. The ancient device hummed to life, recognizing him as an authorized challenger. The massive door swung open, revealing a tunnel that led down into absolute darkness. Jake took a deep breath and stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the hatch sealed behind him with a sound like a tomb closing. A countdown timer appeared on the wall, showing 7 days in glowing numbers. 7 days to survive, Jake whispered to himself. Or die trying. The tunnel sloped downward at a gentle angle, carved from solid rock by tools Jake couldn't imagine. Emergency lighting activated as he walked, revealing walls covered in more of the strange alien symbols. The air was breathable but cold, carrying scents of metal and something else he couldn't identify. After what felt like an hour of walking, Jake emerged into the first chamber of Level 1. The space was enormous, stretching beyond the reach of his helmet lights. Strange plants grew from the walls, glowing with an eerie green light that made them look like living veins. A voice spoke from hidden speakers, using the same translation technology as the Galactic Council. "Welcome to the Crucible of Shadows, Challenger. You face the first trial. Survive the living garden for 24 standard hours. Beware, for these plants hunger for the life force of sentient beings." As if responding to the announcement, the plants began to move. Vines thick as Jake's arms stretched toward him from the walls. Flowers the size of dinner plates opened to reveal rows of needle-sharp thorns. The sweet scent he had noticed earlier grew stronger, and Jake felt his head begin to swim. Poison, he realized, quickly sealing his helmet's air system. The plants were trying to drug him, to make him an easy meal. Jake drew his energy weapon and fired at the nearest vine. The plant recoiled with what sounded like a scream, but more vines took its place. They moved with surprising speed, whipping through the air where his head had been moments before. Running seemed like the smart choice, but Jake forced himself to stop and observe. Dr. Thompson had said the survivors studied the challenges instead of rushing through them. What patterns could he find here? The plants moved in response to vibration, he noticed. They attacked anything that made noise or movement. But they also seemed to have a limited range. The vines couldn't stretch more than 20 feet from there. Root systems. Jake pulled a small rock from his supply pack and threw it across the chamber. The plants in that area immediately attacked the sound, leaving other areas temporarily undefended. He smiled grimly. These creatures were dangerous, but predictable. For the next 24 hours, Jake played a deadly game of hide-and-seek with the carnivorous plants. He learned their patterns, found safe zones where he could rest, and discovered that the plants became less active during certain periods. When the timer finally counted down to 0, he had survived his first trial. "Trial 1 complete," the voice announced. "Proceed to Level 2. A new passage opened in the chamber's far wall. Jake gathered his supplies and moved forward, feeling a small surge of confidence. He had faced the Crucible's first test and lived. Maybe he actually had a chance. Level 2 was a maze of tunnels and caves carved from natural rock formations. The air here was warmer but carried new dangers. Jake heard sounds echoing from the darkness, sounds that made his hair stand on end. Growls, scratches, and something that might have been laughter. "Welcome to the hunting grounds," the voice announced. "Here dwell the shadow wolves, creatures bred from the nightmares of a dozen worlds. They hunt in packs and can phase in and out of visible reality. Survive for 48 hours. Jake had read about the shadow wolves in the casualty reports. They had killed General Thrak, a being 10 times stronger than any human. The reports said they were smart, fast, and nearly impossible to see coming. A sound like distant thunder echoed through the tunnels. Jake pressed himself against the wall and tried to control his breathing. Something was moving in the darkness. Ahead, something big enough to shake the ground with each step. 3 shapes materialized from the shadows, and Jake's blood froze. The shadow wolves looked like a cross between earthly wolves and living darkness. Their bodies seemed to shift between solid matter and smoke. Glowing red eyes fixed on him with predatory intelligence. The largest wolf tilted its head and made a sound that chilled Jake's soul. It was definitely laughter, but laughter with too many teeth. Jake raised his energy weapon, knowing it would do little good against creatures that could become immaterial at will. The wolves began to circle him, moving with perfect coordination. They had done this many times before, But Jake had one advantage the wolves didn't expect. He was human, and humans had been prey animals once. Deep in his brain were instincts older than civilization, instincts that had helped his ancestors survive when much larger predators ruled the world. Instead of running or fighting, Jake did something that surprised even himself. He dropped to the ground and played dead, slowing his breathing and heartbeat as much as possible. The wolves approached cautiously. Jake could smell their breath, feel their body heat as they sniffed around him. One wolf prodded him with its nose, testing for signs of life. Jake waited until all 3 wolves were close, then triggered the emergency flare from his supply pack. Brilliant light flooded the tunnel, and the shadow wolves shrieked in pain and surprise. Their bodies became fully solid as the light touched them, unable to phase into darkness. Jake rolled away and ran, using his helmet lights to stay ahead of the temporarily blinded predators. He could hear them recovering behind him, their angry howls echoing through the caves. For the next 48 hours, Jake used every trick he could think of to stay alive. He set traps using his limited supplies, used sound to confuse the wolves' tracking abilities, and turned their pack-hunting instincts against them by leading them into dead ends where they couldn't coordinate effectively. When the timer finally reached 0, Jake was exhausted, injured, and down to his last energy cell. But he was alive. Trial 2 complete, the voice announced with what Jake thought might be surprise. Proceed to level 3. High above the planet, in a ship that monitored the Crucible's sensor feeds, Korath leaned forward in his command chair. The human's tactics were unlike anything he had seen before. Where other challengers relied on strength or special abilities, this young Earthling used creativity and adaptability. For the first time in decades, Korath felt something stirring in his ancient heart. Was it possible that this fragile-looking creature might actually survive the trials that had claimed so many champions? The great hunter's interest was now fully awakened. Jake Miller had begun to earn something that Korath had never given to any being outside his own species: respect. Jake stumbled into level 3, his body aching from dozens of small cuts and bruises. The shadow wolves had tested him beyond anything he thought possible, but he had survived. Now he faced something that looked completely different from the natural caves and tunnels above. This level was clearly artificial, with smooth metal walls and floors that hummed with hidden energy. Strange geometric patterns covered every surface, shifting and changing as Jake watched. The air itself seemed to buzz with electricity. "Welcome to the Mind Maze," the voice announced. "Here you will face your deepest fears made real. Many challengers have broken not in body, but in spirit. The trial lasts 72 hours. Before Jake could react, the walls around him began to change. The metal surfaces became transparent, revealing scenes that made his heart race with terror. He saw Earth burning, consumed by alien weapons. He watched his family and friends dying while he stood helpless to save them. "It's not real," Jake told himself, but the images felt completely authentic. He could smell the smoke, hear the screams, feel the heat of the flames on his skin. The scenes shifted, showing him different nightmares. He saw himself failing at the Crucible, his broken body becoming another casualty statistic. He watched humanity being expelled from the Galactic Council in shame, forever branded as weaklings who couldn't protect their own. Jake closed his eyes, but the visions followed him into darkness. They attacked his mind with surgical precision, finding every doubt and fear he had ever harbored. The psychological warfare was more brutal than any physical assault he had endured. Hours passed in torment. Jake found himself curled in a corner, shaking as the false visions tore at his sanity. This was how other challengers had broken, he realized. Not from injury or exhaustion, but from having their spirits crushed by their own worst fears. High above the planet, Korath watched the sensor readings with growing fascination. Most challengers either broke quickly on this level or fought against the illusions with raw mental force. The human was doing neither. Instead, Jake was analyzing the visions themselves, looking for patterns and inconsistencies. Even while trembling with fear, his human mind was working to understand the nature of the psychological attack. "Clever little creature," Korath murmured to himself. "You see past the fear to the mechanism beneath." Jake began to notice that the visions had timing patterns. They grew stronger and weaker in cycles, like waves on a beach. During the weak periods, he could think more clearly. During the strong periods, he simply endured. On the second day, Jake made a discovery that changed everything. The visions were feeding off his emotional responses. The more afraid he became, the stronger they grew. But when he managed to stay calm, they weakened noticeably. "It's like a feedback loop," he whispered to himself during a brief respite. "They get stronger when I'm scared, which makes me more scared, which makes them stronger." Armed with this knowledge, Jake began to fight back in a way the Crucible's designers had never expected. Instead of trying to overcome his fears with courage, he began to accept them as natural human emotions while refusing to let them control his actions. When the vision showed him Earth's destruction, Jake acknowledged his fear for his home world, while reminding himself that he was here precisely to prevent such a future. When they showed him failing the trials, he accepted that death was possible while choosing to continue anyway. Korath leaned forward in his command chair, his ancient eyes wide with surprise. No challenger had ever approached the psychological trials this way. Most tried to suppress their fears or fight them with determination. The human was doing something far more sophisticated. "You embrace the fear without being controlled by it," Korath said aloud. "Remarkable." By the third day, Jake had found a strange kind of peace within the nightmare visions. They still frightened him, but they no longer paralyzed him. He moved through the mind maze methodically, ignoring the false horrors while searching for the exit. When the 72-hour timer finally reached 0, Jake was exhausted but unbroken. The visions faded, leaving him alone in a simple metal room with a single doorway leading deeper into the Crucible. "Trial 3 complete," the voice announced, and Jake thought he detected a note of surprise in the artificial tone. For the first time since entering the Crucible, Korath made a decision that surprised even himself. He activated a communication channel to the complex below, something he had never done for any challenger. Jake's helmet crackled with an incoming transmission. A deep, gravelly voice spoke in heavily accented galactic standard. "Human challenger," the voice said, and Jake felt his blood freeze. He recognized it from the records Captain Rodriguez had shown him. This was Korath, the legendary hunter. "I am Korath of the Valdren," the voice continued. "I have watched your progress through the trials. You show promise." Jake found his voice. "Why are you contacting me?" "Because you approach the Crucible as I once did, long ago, with intelligence rather than mere force. But be warned, young human. Level 4 will test not just your survival skills, but your willingness to make impossible choices. Remember this, the strongest steel is forged in the hottest flames." The transmission ended, leaving Jake alone with his racing thoughts. Korath, the galaxy's most feared predator, had spoken to him. More importantly, the hunter had offered advice. As Jake approached the entrance to Level 4, he wondered what trials could be so terrible that even Korath felt the need to warn him. But for the first time since entering the Crucible, he didn't feel completely alone. Somewhere above, the greatest hunter in the galaxy was watching, and perhaps even hoping for his success. The door to Level 4 opened with a sound like grinding bones. Whatever lay beyond would test him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But Jake Miller, the young human who had dared to challenge the galaxy's deadliest trial, stepped forward into the darkness with newfound determination. Behind him, the mind maze fell silent, its psychological weapons defeated by something the ancient builders had never anticipated, the human ability to acknowledge fear while refusing to surrender to it. Level 4 looked like a twisted version of a city. Buildings rose from the floor in impossible geometries, connected by bridges that seemed to defy gravity. The lighting came from sources Jake couldn't identify, casting everything in an eerie orange glow that made shadows dance and shift. "Welcome to the City of Choices," the voice announced. "Here you will face moral trials. Your decisions will determine not only your survival, but your worthiness to proceed. You have 96 hours. Jake moved cautiously through the strange streets, his footsteps echoing off the alien architecture. Everything felt wrong here, as if the very geometry of the space was designed to confuse and disorient visitors. He hadn't gone far when he heard something that made him stop cold. Voices, crying for help. Human voices. Jake rounded a corner and found a sight that made his heart race. A group of people unmistakably human were trapped inside a transparent cage suspended over a pit of what looked like acid. Men, women, and children pressed against the walls of their prison, their faces twisted with terror. "Please," a woman called out when she saw him. "Help us! We've been trapped here for days." Jake approached the cage, his mind racing. This had to be another illusion like the mind maze. But these people looked and sounded completely real. He could see tears on their faces, hear the fear in their voices. A control panel near the cage showed two options. He could release the prisoners immediately, but doing so would trigger a trap that would kill him instantly. Or he could find a safer way to free them, but it would take time they might not have. The acid level in the pit was slowly rising. "This is impossible," Jake whispered. Every instinct screamed at him to save these people immediately, regardless of the cost to himself. But a rational part of his mind insisted they couldn't be real. As he studied the situation, Jake noticed something that changed everything. One of the children in the cage was wearing a shirt with a logo from a company that had only existed for 2 years. But the crucible was thousands of years old. "Your holograms," Jake said aloud. "Advanced ones, but still artificial." The moment he spoke, the illusions became more aggressive. "Please," the woman begged, "don't leave us to die. We're real. We have families." Jake forced himself to walk away, his heart breaking even though he knew they weren't real people. This was the test, he realized. The Crucible wanted to see if he would sacrifice himself for others, even when those others might be illusions. But the trials weren't finished with him. The next scenario was even more brutal. Jake found himself in a room with 2 chambers, each containing a single person. A timer on the wall showed he had 60 seconds to choose which chamber to open. The other person would die. One chamber held an elderly man, the other a young child. Both looked at him with pleading eyes, begging to be saved. Jake had 30 seconds to decide who lived and who died. "This is sick," Jake said, studying the controls desperately. There had to be another option, some way to save both people. With 10 seconds left, Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of choosing one chamber, he used his energy weapon to blast the control panel. Sparks flew as the system overloaded, and both chambers opened simultaneously. "Impossible choice refused," Jake declared. "I won't play games with people's lives." The holographic people flickered and vanished, but not before Jake saw something that shook him. For just a moment, the child had smiled and nodded, as if approving of his choice. The trials continued for 4 days, each one more emotionally brutal than the last. Jake faced scenario after scenario where he was forced to choose between saving himself and saving others. Each time, he found ways to reject the premise of the test itself. When presented with a burning building where he could only save one of several trapped people, Jake found a way to collapse part of the structure that created an escape route for everyone. When faced with a choice between his own life and the lives of strangers, he consistently chose to risk himself rather than abandon others. High above the planet, Korath felt something he had never experienced before. The young human wasn't just surviving the moral trials, He was conquering them in a way that defied the Crucible's very purpose. He refuses to accept that anyone must die, Korath said to himself, his voice filled with wonder. Even when faced with impossible choices, he finds a third option. Korath thought back to his own trials decades ago. He had passed the moral tests through cold logic and predatory instincts, accepting necessary losses as the price of survival. But this human approached every challenge as if no sacrifice was acceptable, as if every life had infinite value. The great hunter realized something that shook him to his core. Despite their vastly different species and abilities, he and Jake shared something fundamental. They both refused to give up when faced with the impossible. But where Korath used determination and superior strength, Jake used hope and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. "You fight as I once fought," Korath whispered. "Not just to survive, but to prove that the impossible can be overcome." As Jake completed the final moral trial by finding a way to save a group of civilians while still accomplishing his mission objective, Korath made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew him, the legendary hunter, who had never shown respect for any being outside his own species, began preparing to transport down to the Crucible himself. Jake Miller had earned something that Korath had never granted to another living being: recognition as an equal. On level 5, Jake emerged, battered but spiritually unbroken. He had faced every scenario the Crucible could devise and refused to compromise his principles. Every choice had reaffirmed his belief that there was always another way, always hope for a better solution. As he approached the entrance to level 6, Jake felt a strange sensation. For the first time since entering the Crucible, he wasn't alone. Someone was coming to meet him, someone who had begun to understand that strength came in forms the galaxy had never recognized, and that the fragile young human from Earth might possess the rarest kind of courage in the universe, the courage to never give up on others no matter how impossible the situation seemed. Jake stepped through the entrance to level 6 and froze. The chamber before him was massive, larger than any space he had encountered in the Crucible. Ancient pillars stretched up into darkness, covered in glowing symbols that pulsed with rhythmic light. But what stopped Jake cold wasn't the architecture. It was the figure waiting for him in the center of the chamber. Korath stood like a mountain of living shadow, 8 feet of muscle and natural armor that could have been carved from stone. His red eyes glowed in the dim light, and his claws reflected the dancing patterns from the walls. He looked exactly like the images Jake had studied, except more terrifying in person. "You came," Jake said, surprised that his voice remained steady. "I had to see for myself," Korath replied, his deep voice echoing through the chamber. "In all my years, I have never witnessed anything like your trials. You have done something I thought impossible." Jake kept his distance, unsure whether the legendary hunter was there as friend or enemy. "What did I do?" "You completed the moral trials without losing your spirit," Korath explained. "Most challengers who survive those tests do so by becoming cold, by accepting that some deaths are necessary. You refuse to accept any death as necessary." The great hunter began to circle Jake slowly, his movements fluid and predatory. "When I faced those same trials decades ago, I saved myself by choosing logic over emotion. I let some die to save others. It was the practical choice, the survivor's choice. But you survived," Jake pointed out. Korath's laugh was like grinding stone. "Yes, I survived, but I lost something in those chambers, something I didn't even know I valued until I watched you refuse to give it up." "What?" "Hope," Korath said, simply. "The belief that impossible problems have solutions if you just refuse to accept defeat." The chamber around them began to change. The walls shifted and rearranged themselves, revealing a control room filled with ancient technology. Screens activated, showing views of the entire Crucible complex. "This is level 6, Korath explained, "the command center of the Crucible. Here, successful challengers face their final choice. A holographic interface appeared before Jake, displaying two options in symbols he somehow understood. The first option would record his completion of the trial, earning him individual glory and proving humanity worthy of respect. The second option was more complex. The second choice allows you to modify the crucible itself, Korath said. You can change the trials, make them less deadly for future challengers. But doing so means your victory becomes anonymous. History will not remember your name. Jake studied the interface, understanding the weight of the decision. He could claim personal glory and species recognition, or he could use his success to save lives in the future. How many beings have chosen the second option? Jake asked. In the 1,000 years I have watched this place, Korath replied, only 3, and never for the reasons you are considering. Jake looked at the legendary hunter. What reasons am I considering? Korath's expression changed, showing something that might have been admiration. You are thinking that glory means nothing if future challengers die for it. You are wondering how many lives you could save by making the crucible less lethal. Isn't that obvious? The question seemed to surprise Korath. To most beings, no. Personal achievement and species recognition are powerful motivators. Very few would sacrifice their moment of triumph to help strangers they will never meet. Jake reached toward the interface, then paused. What did you choose when you completed the trial? I chose glory, Korath admitted. I was young and proud. I wanted my name remembered across the galaxy. Do you regret it? Korath was quiet for a long moment. I did not, until today. Watching your trials has reminded me of something I had forgotten. True strength is not about what you can take or achieve. It is about what you can give. Jake nodded and activated the second option. The interface flickered to life, allowing him access to the Crucible's ancient systems. Working quickly, he began implementing safety protocols and rescue systems that would reduce the facility's deadly reputation. You are creating emergency shelters on each level, Korath observed. And automated medical systems. These changes will save hundreds of lives over the coming centuries. Good, Jake said simply, continuing his work. As Jake finished his modifications, Korath made a decision that surprised them both. The Great Hunter approached the interface and added his own access codes, implementing additional changes that Jake couldn't have made alone. Why are you helping me? Jake asked. Because you have shown me something I thought was lost forever, Korath replied. You have reminded me what it means to be truly strong. When they finished, the Crucible had been transformed from a death trap into a challenging but survivable trial. Future generations would face difficult tests, but they would also have real chances to succeed. The chamber's exit opened, revealing a transport platform that would carry them back to the surface. But before they left, Korath turned to Jake with an expression of profound respect. Jake Miller of Earth, the Great Hunter said formally. You have completed trials that have broken champions from across the galaxy. But more than that, you have shown that true courage lies not in accepting necessary evils, but in refusing to believe that any evil is truly necessary. Korath raised one massive clawed hand and placed it on Jake's shoulder. The gesture was gentle, despite the alien's terrifying appearance. I name you, brother, Korath declared. Not of blood, but of spirit. You fight with the heart of a true warrior. Jake felt tears forming in his eyes. The acceptance meant more than any glory or recognition ever could. They returned to the surface, together, where news of Jake's success had already spread across the galaxy. But it was the image of Korath and Jake emerging side by side that truly shocked the Galactic Council. When they reached Nexus Station, the reception was unlike anything in galactic history. High Counselor Veltarn publicly apologized for his species' dismissal of human potential. Ambassador Thylix began drafting new protocols based on human approaches to seemingly impossible problems. But Jake barely noticed the ceremony or the speeches. He was too busy listening to Korath tell stories of his own trials, sharing the wisdom of a great hunter with a young human who had earned the rarest title in the galaxy. Brother. The Crucible had been designed to break spirits and forge killers. Instead, it had created something the galaxy had never seen before, a friendship that transcended species, born from mutual recognition of true strength. Jake Miller had entered the Crucible to prove humanity's worth. He emerged having proved something far more important, that the greatest victories come not from what you can destroy, but from what you choose to save. And in the years that followed, as countless beings survived trials that would have killed them under the old system, Jake's real victory became clear. He had not just survived the impossible. He had made the impossible a little less deadly for everyone who came after.